the strength given me under pledge of vow, and have betrayed it to a woman, a Canaanite, my faithless enemy. Wow. At line 407, he says, I yielded and unlocked to her, Delilah, all my heart, who with a grain of manhood well resolved might easily have shook off all her snares, foul effeminacy. And then a little bit later at line 417, unmanly, he says. This effeminacy thing takes us back to Paradise Lost, book 11, 634. This is pure Milton, and the argument is simple. When a man lets a woman have control over him, he turns effeminate. Now, again, this misogyny, we're going to obviously have to say this is clearly a part of Milton's project, right? Manoah pours it on line 420, and he says, I can't praise thy marriage choices, son. You got to love the humor of that line and the dark irony of it. In other words, I told you so. At line 433, he says it, bitterly hast thou paid, and still art paying, that rigid score. A worse thing yet remains. And this remaining thing, of course, is going to set up the Dagon feast and all of that. At 471, Samson's hope, he says it, that maybe God will allow for them to all die. Violence hopefully will be the solution. At 483, we've got the father Manoah that says, I've got a chance to get you a ransom. This is all, of course, extra biblical. It's not actually in the story, but it is interesting because we want to point out that this is a whole lot like Crito. And at line 505 and 518, there's this interesting notion that it's all about self-preservation. And why don't you let me take you home to your country and to the sacred house? In other words, let me take you back home. And this is very much like what Crito says to Socrates in Plato's dialogue. Crito, we gave a lecture on this earlier, and you'll remember that Socrates' response is, no, that wouldn't be just. For Samson, he says no, but the reason he says no is because he says, I deserve the punishment that I am receiving here. Socrates never said he deserved the punishment. He just said, the state is right. If it punishes me, therefore, it must be right, and I have to observe it even though I feel that it's wrong. In line 587, we have the promise that maybe with the return of Samson's hair, there might be some opportunity to be able. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to skip for a second to 533. Samson comments on the fact that he was softened with pleasure and voluptuous life, and ultimately he laid his head in the lascivious lap of a deceitful concubine who shore me, and we think here of this idea. And we've seen this before, even in Machiavelli's Prince. Remember, he said this. It's in times of peace that a prince must go out, harden himself, go hunting, and all those kinds of things. Why? Because the greatest threat, we saw this as well, didn't we, even in Plato's Republic, the greatest threat is, of course, that you'll start to get weak. And of course, once you get weak, that may explain why Plato had such a love for Sparta in his understanding of Republic, right? At line 587, at 562, one more time with this effeminate thing going on, right? And then finally at 587, we're told that his locks, his hair might come back, and therefore strength. 595, Samson says it, my hopes all are flat. Right, and the notion of my genial spirits, Drew, reminds us of that slack hand of Adam in Paradise Lost, doesn't it? Right, finally at 648, he says it. Hopeless are all my evils, all remedies. This one prayer yet remains. Might I be heard, no long petition, speedy death, the close of all my miseries and the balm. At line 651, I just hope, he says, that I can just die. At line 654, the chorus will begin to talk about patience and the importance of patience. We think about Paradise Lost, 9:32 through 33, and Paradise Regained, book 1, line 426, and the importance of patience. And then at line 667, we have the chorus with the question of theodicy. What is man? We think of the Psalm 8 passage 4 through 8 that thou art mindful of. And remember that Hamlet asked this, what a piece of work is a man, in Hamlet 2:2, when he was talking with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Remember that line's finished with, what is this but a quintessence of dust? Remembering all of that. At line 676, we're going to get that famous philosophy that basically you grow up and you perish as the summer fly. We pointed this out before. The only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters, and there it is. That's the origination in many ways of this line when I say it out loud to you guys. In other words, everything comes to its conclusion. The difference, of course, is that you know about fly swatters. Think about the power of Burns's to a mouse. The minute he jacks the mouse's house, what's the mouse do? Turns around and goes and builds another house. Why? Because the mouse doesn't have memory of the ways in which it maybe has lost its house, right? It keeps going. It only lives in the present, right? We then will get to line 701 and the suffering. He says it. All of life is suffering, and we think about the idea of suffering and the opening that notion of what Gautama Buddha learned when he sat under his Bodhi tree, that life is suffering, right? Line 710, we're finished with part 1 of this poem. And Delilah will arrive. She's referenced at line 710 as a beautiful ship, bedecked and sailing. She smells well. She shows up. And at line 725, Samson will call her my wife, my traitress. By the way, we should point out that in the biblical account, Samson is not married to Delilah. Why would Milton have them married? I think there's, so he can further this misogynistic project of his. And at 732, Delilah will then begin to speak. And we got to pay attention now to this exchange, because this is really the heart of the poem. She says it. With doubtful feet and wavering resolution I came, still dreading thy displeasure, Samson, which to have merited without excuse I cannot but acknowledge. I know I was wrong, she says. Yet, if tears may expiate, though the fact more evil drew in the perverse event than I foresaw, in other words, I didn't know it was going to end this badly for you. My penance hath not slackened, though my pardon no way assured. In other words, I'm hoping you will forgive me. But conjugal affection prevailing over fear and timorous doubt hath led me on, desirous to behold once more thy face and know of thy estate, if aught in my ability may serve to lighten what thou sufferest and to appease thy mind with what amends is in my power, though late yet in some part to recompense my rash but more unfortunate misdeed. She calls her deed rash and unfortunate. Of course, right, at 748, Samson's words are out, hyena. Hyena, of course, the animal that's tricky or whatever. I don't know if Frost built his poem out around these two lines or not. I mean, obviously Frost knew this poem well, right? And then he keeps going. These are thy wanted arts, and arts of every woman false like thee, to break all faith, all vows, deceive, betray, then is repentant, to submit, beseech, and reconcilement move with feigned remorse. You're only acting like you're sad. Confess and promise wonders in her change. No truly penitent, but chief to try her husband, how far urged his patience bears, his virtue or weakness, which way to assail. Then with more cautious and instructed skill, again transgress. Wow. And again submits. In other words, I know what you are. You're just like all women. You're going to come, you're going to cry, you're going to say I'm sorry, you're going to turn around and do it again the minute I forgive you. Wow. Let's just point out, by the way, let's point out the irony of this. Samson is going to beg God to forgive him and hope that God does. Delilah will beg Samson to forgive her, and Samson's response will be, never. It's an interesting idea. That wisest and best men, full oft beguiled with goodness, principled not to reject the penitent but ever to forgive, are drawn to wear out miserable days, entangled with a poisonous bosom snake. And you knew this was coming, of course, from Milton. There it is. Eve has become the snake by Samson Agonistes. She is serpentine, right? If not by quick destruction, soon cut off, as I by thee 2 ages an example. I will be forever, he says, the example of to all men, beware of beautiful women who will then cut your hair or, any other things they might want to destroy of you. Wow. Now, of course, this is powerful stuff. Delilah will then respond in 766 to 784 with some powerful language, and it's interesting, Eve-like rhetoric, some have pointed out. Yet hear me, Samson. Not that I endeavor to lessen or extenuate my offense, but that on the other side, and if you'll think about it, this is always the Socratic argument, isn't it? The other side. In other words, let's think about both sides of this argument, which is why some people hate intellectuals so much. They always want to see the other side. She says it, on the other side. If it be weighed by itself, with aggravations not surcharged, or else with just allowance counterposed, I may, if possible, thy pardon find the easier towards me, or thy hatred less, first granting, as I do, it was a weakness in me, but incident to all our sex, curiosity, inquisitive, importunous secrets, then with like infirmity to publish them. Of course, we hear thinking about Ovid's Metamorphosis, chapter 11, passage 172 to 193. Of course, we think of Eve, we think of Pandora, the idea that women are always curious and they get themselves in trouble with all of this, and then they want to publish it, of course. Both common female faults, was it not weakness also? She turns to him and says, was it not weakness also to make known for importunity, that is for naught, wherein consisted all thy strength and safety? In other words, why did you tell me? You shouldn't have told me. This will sound very much like Eve, who will later in Paradise Lost say, Adam, why did you let me go off alone? To what I did thou showest me first the way, but I to enemies were revealed and should not. But shouldest thou have trusted that to woman's frailty? Ere I to thee, thou to thyself was cruel. Line 784. Well, of course, this is again that instantiation of the patriarchy, and again Milton's nasty misogyny coming through. Notice the irony. It's Delilah who says it, right, and speaks for all women. At line 814. She asks for pity or pardon. At line 819, we have Samson's response, how cunningly the sorceress displays her own transgressions to upbraid me mine. It's nasty, and of course, no forgiveness. At line 843, we come back with Delilah, and she will say, I was threatened, right? And I had to do it at line 867 for the public good. This was my duty, in other words. At line 871, you knew this was coming. Samson says, I thought where all thy circling wiles would end. In other words, now we're back to that Paradise Lost, book 9, 510 to 515 line. The serpent-like, serpentine-like, in other words, he says, I knew. He says it would end in feigned religion, smooth hypocrisy, and then he says it at line 871. Samson says, you were my wife, and you should have been, if you were married to me, you should have been honest and true to me because you were my wife. At line 902, he says it, how foul must thou appear. At line 909, she begs to at least obtain forgiveness. And at line 917, she says, let me take you at least home. I got ways. I know people. She says, I can get you out of this stupid prison. Let me take you home. I'll take care of you. If you will, I'll domesticate you. And at line 927, no, of my condition take no care. It fits not. Thou and I long since are twain, nor think me so unwary or accused to bring my feet again into the snare where once I had been caught. I know thy trains, though dearly to my cost, thy gains and toils, thy fair enchanted cup. We think of Circe, of course, in the Odyssey 10:135, right? And warbling charms, though more on me have power, their force is nulled. So much of adder's wisdom, we're back to the snake thing again, I've learned to fence my ear against thy sorceries. Wow. At line 945, he talks about uxoriousness, extreme devotion to one's wife. For the Princess Bride fans in the house, as you wish. She says, Okay. 551. Well, at least let me touch your hand. Now, we think about the final scenes in all these different Greek stories. Like, for example, when Menelaus is going down that line looking for Helen after the city of Troy has fallen, and he's going to kill her the minute he sees her. And then, of course, he looks at her, and he can't, so he just slaps her and sends her to the boat. And here she asks, can I at least touch your hand? I mean, if only you'd let me touch you, I might be able to change things. And at line 952, Samson will say, not for thy life, lest fierce remembrance wake my sudden rage to tear thee joint by joint at distance. He says it, I forgive thee. Go with that. Bewail thy falsehood and the pious works that have brought forth to make thee memorable among illustrious women. Faithful wives, cherish thy hastened widowhood with the gold of matrimonial treason. So, farewell. Wow. At a distance, I forgive thee. At line 960, she knows it's over. She insults him at line 982, and by line and at line 982, she says, "I'll be named among the famousest." In other words, I'm going to be remembered. And then she even mentions Jael from Judges 4, who is of course the woman who invites the man into her tent and then puts a tent peg through his head while he is sleeping. And then by line 997, she is gone. And Samson says, let her go. She's gone, right? So let her go. God sent her to debase me and aggravate my folly, who committed such a viper. We're back to this serpent thing. His most sacred trust of secrecy, my safety, and my life. The choir will then begin to talk about the notion of women and their beauty, referencing it as a riddle at 10:16. Of course, this is interesting because Samson played the game of a riddle, right? And at line 10:16 or so to 10:33, we've got this whole notion of let a woman in your life, to quote the lines from My Fair Lady, and you got problems. This is some powerfully misogynistic language. And it, at line 10:33 culminates with that either they love nothing or not long. Whoa. The sad part about this, I like to point out, is that Milton had daughters as he wrote this kind of stuff. At 10:53 to 10:60, just keep going. Whate'er it be, to wisest men and best, seeming at first all heavenly under virgin veils, soft, modest, meek, demure. Once joined, that is to say married, the contrary she proves. In other words, a woman changes once she's married. A thorn, intestine, far within defensive arms, a cleaving mischief, in his way to virtue adverse and turbulent, or by her charms draws him awry, enslaved with dotage in his senses depraved to folly and shameful deeds. This reminds us of what Hamlet says to Ophelia, right? I've heard of your paintings too well enough. God hath given you one face and you make yourselves another. And he talks about how women ruin men. This is, of course, the danger of misogyny, that now we're reading it, and yet we've got to pay attention to it, right? Because at line 1063 we are ready to finish this, but at line 1060 and so on, and finishing, notice we've got this whole thing about, but something else is coming. A tempest is coming, in fact, at line 1063. By the way, by 1053, therefore God's universal law gave to the man despotic power over his female, and do all, nor from that right depart an hour, smile she or lower, so shall he least confusion draw in his whole life, not swayed by female usurpation, nor dismayed. Wow. In other words, men, keep your women in check. And again, I think it's important that we point out that this is significant in the history of Western thought, that so many men and women will have read Samson Agonistes and, of course, the other misogynistic lines of Milton, and it will instantiate in many ways why men need to always be wary and concerned about their women. The mention of the word tempest at line 1063 reminds us that Shakespeare has always been there all the time. And now we have at line 1068 the giant Harafa who will show up. Now this is Milton's invention, and he is a Philistine giant. And at line 1091, he has an exchange with Samson, just for a few lines here. And Samson is defiant. He in fact says it at 1091. Hey, why don't you try and taste me? In other words, come over here and I'll jack you, right? At line 1091. Samson is still the Agonistes, the contender, the fighter. It reminds us this exchange of Achilles and Hector in the Iliad, right? At 1156, the giant Harafa will say, your God has abandoned you. And at line 1168, we then have an interesting response. Samson says, all these indignities, for such they are from time, these evils I deserve, and more, acknowledge them from God inflicted on me justly. Yet despair not of his final pardon, whose ear is ever open and his eye gracious to remit the supplicant. Fascinating. Samson assumes God will forgive him, even though Samson refuses to in any way ever forgive Delilah. In confidence whereof I once again defy thee to the trial of mortal fight by combat, to decide whose God is God, thine or whom I with Israel's sons adore. So he says it. I would like to point out that in Samson we have two different kinds of character types. We have Prometheus, who is defiant to the end, right? And we have Job, who is patient, right? Samson 1287, 1296, we have this notion of being patient. I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait. By the way, for those of you who are Monty Python's Holy Grail fans, right, the come back, I'll bite your legs off comes to mind here, because obviously Samson can't fight Harafa, and Harafa is gone by 1244. In line 1306, let's finish now quickly. 1306, a public officer arrives and says, hey, let's go. You're coming to the party. We're gonna humiliate you as part of the fun of our party. Line 1333, Samson says, I'm not going to go. And then at 1381, we'll go ahead and look at this one now for just a second. At line 1381, we'll read 1381. Samson finally decides, be of good cheer. He says, I begin to feel some rousing motions in me which dispose to something extraordinary, my thoughts. I with this messenger will go along, nothing to do, be sure, but may dishonor our law or stain my vow of Nazarite. If there be aught to presage in the mind, this day will be remarkable in my life by some great act, or of my days the last. In other words, the readiness is all, to quote Hamlet. I'm ready to do this. 1413, we have the final words of Samson. Brethren, farewell. Your company along